Hello again, everybody, and God be with you. Well, we come to the end of the Bible Baddies by Bob Hartman. This is the last story I'm going to record. It's also a story about Easter, and it's a story about another one, not so much of a Bible baddie, but a Bible goodie who did some bad things, and in this case found it hard to forgive himself for it. And because it's near Easter, it concerns Easter as well. So let's read The Coward's Tale. Bob introduces it this way. Sometimes the worst kind of badness is the badness inside you, the badness you can't seem to fix. You say something hurtful to somebody, or you lose your temper, or you lie about something, and a minute after you do it, you feel bad, and you wish you could take it all back, but you can't, because you're embarrassed or afraid or worried that something worse might happen if you try to put it right. Everybody feels that way sometimes. Peter did. He was one of Jesus' followers, one of his closest friends. But time and time again, he found himself doing and saying things that disappointed Jesus, things he was sorry for later. This story is about one of those times. And even though Peter tried, he still couldn't find a way to fix and forgive himself. He needed someone to do it for him. Unfortunately, that someone was there, hanging on a cross, rising from the dead, and waiting for him on the beach. The fire was warm, and the end of his beard and the edge of his sandals were just about dry. His belly was full, the taste of fish lingered in his mouth, and a crusty bit of bread clung to his moustache. He just had a big catch. His friends sat round about him. He should have been happy, but he wasn't. His best friend of all was there, you see, the one who had died and come back to life, the one he had abandoned and denied. There had been a fire then as well, and a cold night, and a silent moon. And in the place of the comrades who now chatted around him, there sat strangers and enemies. Peter remembered it well, too well. It was a serving girl who had spoken first. She had been gazing through the flames for some time, trying to catch his eye and to get a good look at his face. But Peter had sat still, still as stone, hunched over, silent, afraid. It was her voice that had set him shivering. This man was with him too, she pointed, with Jesus, who they arrested. Peter held himself tight to stop from shaking. He was afraid. He was afraid. The guards, the arrest, the tortures, the fighting. His friends had scattered, his master in custody. He was afraid. Who wouldn't be? And surely that is why he blurted out, almost without thinking, "Woman, I do not know the man." It was a lie. Of course it was a lie. But if that busybody hadn't stuck her nose in. Before he could fashion his excuse, however, another voice called out from the darkness. "Yes, you're right. I've seen him with Jesus too. You're one of his followers, aren't you?" "No, no," Peter shouted, wishing that somehow he could disappear, hoping to heaven that he could just wake up from this nightmare. "No, I'm not one of them." But the strangers would not be quiet. They would not give up. He was the focus of attention now, and all eyes, we could feel them, were gazing, peering, inspecting, and identifying, each and every one trained on him. Jesus' career had been so public, the miracles so amazing, the crowds so huge. Thousands and thousands of people had seen Jesus and his friends together, with Peter the biggest and noisiest of the bunch. And so it was inevitable that another voice, a third voice, should come to the same conclusion as the rest. Yes, someone called. Definitely. He's from Galilee. He's one of them. No, shouted Peter, his heart racing and his hands sweating. No, he repeated, frantic and afraid. I never even knew the man. And then the rooster crowed. Jesus had said this would happen. In the midst of Peter's boasting about how he would fight to the death for his master, Jesus had contradicted him. No, Peter, he had whispered, before this night is through, before the cockerel calls to the coming dawn, you will deny that you ever knew me. Peter had wept bitterly that day, mixing his tears with the morning dew. And he could find no excuse, no fear, no panic, nor fate to chase away the guilt he felt at having turned his back on his friend. A chunk of wet sand, caked to the side of his leg, dried through just enough to fall off, but it left behind a filmy, sandy residue that irritated him until he brushed it away. And Peter couldn't help thinking that it was just the same way with his guilt. And they'd met a few times, he and Jesus, since that night before Jesus had died. But now Jesus was alive again, and the shock and the joy of those meetings had shaken away great chunks of Peter's guilt and shame. But it wasn't all gone. And because Jesus hadn't mentioned his denial, Peter didn't want to bring it up. And that's why this man with a full belly and warm feet and one amazing resurrected friend wasn't very happy. There was something he needed to do, something he couldn't bring himself to say. There was another reason too. Fish. When they'd first met, he and Jesus, Peter was a fisherman, but Jesus had promised to make him something else, a fisher of men. More than that, Jesus had called him a rock. And when Peter had found the confidence to stand up and say what all the disciples had been thinking, that Jesus was the Messiah, he had received the Master's praise for his insight. But where was Peter now? Sitting on the sand at the side of Lake Galilee. That's where he was. Back where he had started, doing his old job, fishing for fish. But what else was he fit for? What good was a rock that turned to sand at the first whiff of danger? And how could he be a fisher of men when he couldn't even admit his friendship with Jesus to just 3 people? Perhaps being a fisher of fish was all he was good for after all. A gull cried, the fire popped. Then it belched out a puff of smoke. Jesus watched the smoke melt into the air. Then he turned to Peter and said, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Surprised by both the suddenness of the question and by the question itself, Peter had to stop and think. Do I love him more than these? Well, these what? These other disciples? Well, of course I do. Didn't I say once that even if all the others left him, I would remain? And then Peter hung his head in shame. But I didn't, did I? He remembered again. I ran and hid like everybody else, and worse. Meanwhile, Jesus was poking holes in the sand, waiting for an answer. Peter knew what he wanted to say, but after what he'd done, would Jesus believe him, or just think him the worst kind of hypocrite? And so, with his eyes fixed on the sand, he said, both quietly and as firmly as he could, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus set the stick down and looked at Peter's face. Then feed my lambs, he said. This wasn't the response that Peter expected. He thought that Jesus was finally getting round to the denial business, that he'd tell him off, call him a no good liar or a coward or a phony. Peter could understand that. It was the least he deserved. Or maybe, on the other hand, Peter imagined, Jesus would turn to him and say, "It's all right, I understand. Don't worry about it anymore." But he didn't do either of those things. All he said was, "Feed my lambs." And then it dawned on him, perhaps when Jesus had said, "Do you love me more than these?" he hadn't meant these disciples at all. Perhaps he'd meant these fish. Well, not the fish themselves, but the fishing gear, the nets and tackle and rope. Maybe Jesus was saying, do you really intend to go back to being a fisher of fish? Or do you want to carry on working for me? Peter was going to ask, but Jesus got there first. "Simon, son of John," he repeated, "do you love me?" There was that question again. But perhaps Jesus hadn't heard him the first time. The answer had been rather quiet. But Peter was feeling more confident now. So he looked at Jesus this time. Well, glanced at him really. And he gave him the same answer. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Then feed my sheep," replied Jesus. That's it, thought Peter. He does want me back. He still wants me to be a fisher of men. And he still believes I can be a rock. And now he wants me to be a shepherd as well, to take care of his followers. He wants me back. He thinks I can do it. Everything is all right again. Peter leapt to his feet, ready to throw his nets on the fire. When Jesus took him by the arm, led him away from the others, and asked him one more time, "Do you love me?" Well, this is silly, thought Peter. We dealt with all that already. Surely Jesus had heard him the first two times. What was the point of saying it a third time? Peter shut his eyes and sighed. Some rock he was turning out to be. More like rock for brains. Peter saw it all now. Jesus was giving him his job back, yes, but he was giving him something more. A chance to make up for those other 3 times. A chance to say what he should have said that night. A chance to speak the truth from his heart. A chance to deal with it once and for all. Peter opened his eyes and wiped them dry with the back of his hand. Then he looked right at Jesus, right into his eyes, and said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And in return, Jesus, smiling a knowing everything will be all right kind of smile, and said for the 3rd time, "Then feed my sheep." They wandered slowly back to the others. The fire was warm. Peter's belly was full. He was surrounded by his friends. And now, for the first time in a long time, Peter was happy. Not only because his best friend was alive again, but also because something had come back to life in him as well. So Peter, who went on to help found the Christian church, had been pointed out to him by Jesus the juxtaposition between the 3 denials and the 3 questions. Do you love me? Of course, we know that Peter couldn't have said, yes, I know him, and I'm prepared to die with him, because that wasn't God's plan. It's interesting, isn't it, that God's plan had those 3 questions, the 3 denials, and then the 3 times the chance to say, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Well, that's the end of the stories from the Bible Baddies. Easter's coming up. I'm going to take a bit of a break now because I don't have any other stories readily at hand, not of this sort anyway, to read. I will carry on looking, and if I find some more, I'll perhaps record them. In the meantime, if you'd like to let me know how you've enjoyed them or otherwise, please do so. Anyway, I wish you all a happy Easter. Have a safe one, and God be with you.